Hello there, everyone. Welcome to another book review brought to you by Camille's Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers. Because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And it's my turn to give a book review, and I am doing mine on the first book in the Legend of Oescienne, The Finding, by Jenna Elizabeth Johnson. I actually got this book directly from the author herself when I met her at the Phoenix Fan Fusion last year. I was having some fun on the bottom floor talking with artists and writers, looking for information, pointers, and trying to make some contacts. I saw that Jenna Johnson was manning a booth with a ton of dragon paintings and books, and because I've been working on my own story with dragons, I went on over and talked with her. We mostly talked about how we could write relationships between dragons and humans in ways that were not the traditional antagonistic dynamic, or where the dragon is the human's faithful steed. And she offered for me to read her book and see how she had written their relationships as kind of equals, how dragons and humans could be equals in a relationship. The experience I had reading her book was honestly not the one that I expected. The Finding is the story of how the young girl Jara lives her formative years as a child. She is the last human known in all of Oescienne, and the one prophesied to bring about the terrible war that will purge the lands of the villainous Crimson King. And she is raised by two dragons, Jax and Humbra. She goes through her life at school, making friends, dealing with bullies, learning valuable lessons, and just overall playing around. For nearly 500 pages, it is like reading an extension of the opening to the Fellowship of the Ring. And as someone who loves The Lord of the Rings and even loves the opening to the Fellowship, there are some things that I have to say about Johnson's approach. But first, let me give my general review. The Finding is a well-written novel that is easily accessible to most ages. The style of narrating this is the kind that you don't usually find in YA or adult fiction. That is third-person omniscient. You jump from one person's inner thoughts and perspectives at the blink of an eye to another, and in some cases, that perspective can change up to 3 times all on the same page. It can be a little jarring at first until you get used to it, and you have to really pay attention or the thoughts don't line up with the characters. The story flows well and covers Jara growing up from being a newborn all the way to her preteen days. Johnson does a good job of giving a voice to her younger characters and their thoughts. The kids might use bigger words than most at their age are capable of using, but it feels like you are seeing the actions and thoughts of 10 or 12-year-olds. Real 10 and 12-year-olds. The characters for the most part feel very natural, and though Jara's bullies are a little bit cartoonish, it still makes sense. And some of the important characters, I think, are introduced a little too late in the book. I appreciate the world building. The idea of different kingdoms of mixed races of elves, dragon rulers, and other groups running about is fantastic and lends a lot of diversity and color to the overall story. There is a neat and long history behind the Legend of Oescienne, and it's really fascinating. However, there is a problem with the reveals and the twists that are made in the book. The problem is that it's not that they aren't good, it's just that they come at moments that cheapen the experience, if that makes sense. They could have been more impactful, but instead they're just treated as small tidbits. Furthermore, there is an art to dragging out suspense within a longer novel, and Johnson doesn't do a very great job of that. She introduces moments of suspense and then kind of forgets them until they become applicable, relevant, like 200 pages later, and that just doesn't work out very well. However, Jara's experience and growth kept me going despite these kinds of mistakes, as well as some of the stuff that you get to see the Dragon Jax doing in the background. Still, with that being said, this book itself is hard for me to recommend on its own. You might find it enjoyable, and I really have to check out the rest of the series to see how it stacks up. But if you enjoy slow-paced fantasy novels, then this is probably right for you. But one thing I found with this book, coming back to my earlier comment about how it reminded me of the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, is that it fails to replicate the feeling of normalcy that Tolkien had in his first book. The opening of the Fellowship takes place in a fantasy world with creatures called hobbits. We don't even get to see humans yet. And yet it feels natural. The Finding does the same, but it doesn't replicate the same natural feels. One thing that people who complain about the trilogy's opening don't realize is how important the opening of the Fellowship is for the characters and their story overall. In those opening chapters, Tolkien establishes a place that is both fantastical and feels familiar. The hobbits and their society is an idealized version of family, hearth, home, and the countryside. And it feels like you could easily go out there with either a bus ride or with your own car ride, or maybe you might even find it in your own backyard or sitting at your home with your family. It just feels very natural. It's so remarkably like our own. Whereas when you read The Finding, it tries to feel like our world, but it's stuffed unceremoniously into a fantasy one. And one of the biggest and most jarring examples of this is actually the school that Jara goes to. At one point I sat back and I'm like, wait a second, why is there only this one school for like an entire 3 provinces? Why are these really rich kids who are living in a city going to a school in the countryside about 30 miles away? Being a teacher myself and having to be in a school that is set more rurally, I look at this and I'm like, this just does not feel natural, and I can't even justify it in a fantasy realm. And some of the locations just really felt out of place, and the attitudes of the elves felt inconsistent too. Tolkien takes his time with crafting his world and making it feel normal to us, the strangers, but you do not get that in Oescienne. As a result, Middle-earth feels more like what Oescienne wanted to be, but it's just, I found it really hard to immerse myself in the world of The Finding. And when a story is this slow-paced, it can be very hard to get into it unless you are able to draw your audience in that way. So those are my thoughts and my recommendations for The Finding by Jenna Johnson. If you want to check out this book, it is readily available through Amazon and Kindle. Let us know if there's a story or a book that you would like us to review. And if you'd like to have some writing advice for authors out there, please check out our podcast, Camille's Harem. And we also have writing exercises for you at our Pinterest page, discussions over our subreddits. And if you would like to help us in finding terrible fan fictions, please send us links to them so we can do epic readings of them for your enjoyment. And until the next video, y'all, tschüss.